The Teacup Poisoner is one of the most unique and sadistic serial killers to ever come out of Britain. His method, unlike any other, he would gradually poison the people around him to be able to watch them slowly and painfully die in front of his eyes. And it turns out the victims of his crimes were nothing more than guinea pigs to him. Just test subjects, just games to play until they eventually succumbed to his poisons and died. So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case, another serial killer case. So that's 2 in a row now. Another English serial killer as well. I promise I'll try and mix it up by the next video. But today we're going to be talking about the Teacup Poisoner. One of the most interesting serial killers I've come across in a while, because this is just so different to anything else I've ever covered. But quickly, before we get into the case, I do just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Casetify. If you're a regular Eleanor Neale channel viewer, then I have no doubt in my mind that you already know what Casetify is. But if you don't, let me put you on. Casetify is the world's most popular tech accessory brand. They're known for their global collaborations and their extremely protective phone cases. Let me tell you, I have been using exclusively Casetify phone cases for years now, and I have not once smashed my phone since I was a teenager. That's 5 years ago. No, it's 3. Wait, I'll have this crisis another time. Let me talk about Casetify. And they've recently brought out 2 really cool new products that I really want to show you because I'm so excited. So first of all, they have the bounce cases. And this is mine. This is the one I'm currently using on my phone. And look at these. These make your phone bounce when you drop it on the floor. These are their most protective cases yet. This one is drop tested from over 21 feet in the air. 21 freaking feet. And then they also have the clear cases, which I'm really excited about. I personally think that basics like this are so underrated. Like, just look how sleek it is. These are the slimmest cases in the whole collection. But what sets the Casetify clear cases apart from just your regular schmegular clear cases is that they've got UV defense tech. It basically blocks the UV rays from the sun, which is what causes clear cases to go like yellowy browny. You know, when they discolor and they don't look that nice after a few months. Well, Casetify's literally have technology in them to stop that, which I'm so excited for because that's why I never really use clear cases because I'm scared of them getting discolored. But now you don't have to worry. The clear cases are still super protective, don't worry. They are drop tested from over 6 feet in the air, which I know 6 feet sounds like less now that I've said 21 earlier, but 6 feet, I don't think that many of you are over 6 feet tall. And that's not a read. I just think I probably have quite a short audience. So it's still gonna protect your phone, don't you worry. And I think, especially if you're buying an expensive phone, like I just bought the iPhone 14, why would you not want to protect that? You've spent so much money on the actual phone, you don't want to be then spending money on repairing your screen every few months because you've smashed it. By the way, both the bounce cases and the clear cases are both MagSafe compatible, which means you can wireless charge them, and they're both made with 65% recycled and plant-based materials, like all the other Casetify cases. And with Christmas almost here, I think Casetify cases are the perfect gift for like anyone. Everyone has a phone pretty much, and everyone needs to protect that phone. And I think especially with like the customizable ones, it's such a thoughtful, personal present. To guarantee arrival before Christmas, make sure you're putting in your orders by December 8th if you're going to use standard shipping, or December 16th with express shipping. And as always, Casetify are very kindly offering you guys 15% off of your order when you go to casetify.com/Eleanor. The link is also down below in the description, and that discount will be automatically applied at checkout, so you don't even need to worry. Thanks again to Casetify for sponsoring this video. Love you guys. And quickly, before we get into this video, I do just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Quickly, before we get into this case, I do just want to give some content warnings. In this video, we're going to be discussing themes of suicidal thoughts, psychopathy, personality disorders, schizophrenia, and there's also going to be talk of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime and like adoration of that, you know, like support of that. So if any of that is triggering to you and you don't think you can watch this video, I totally understand. Click out now. Hopefully I'll get to see you some other time with a different video, but look after yourself. And with all that being said, let's get into the case. So today's case is a very unique one. I know I've used that word so many times, but it just is. Everything about it is so characteristically different. So I can't sit here and tell you what city it took place in because it took place in multiple cities. And I can't sit here and tell you how old the serial killer was because he was a bunch of different ages. It just seemed that tragedy followed Graham Young wherever he went. Graham Frederick Young was born on September 7th, 1947 in northwest London to his parents Fred and Molly. Graham was the younger of two children. He had an older sister who was actually quite a bit older than him, I think by like 6 or 7 years. Her name was Winifred. But sadly, just a couple of months after Graham was born, when he was still a newborn baby, his life started to fall apart around him. His mother, Molly, fell very suddenly ill shortly after giving birth to Graham. She had tuberculosis and it came on really, really quickly and progressed really, really rapidly. She was very ill. Within just a couple of months of getting her diagnosis, Molly passed away from her tuberculosis. And what was supposed to be one of the happiest times of the family's lives, you know, welcoming a new baby in, they couldn't even enjoy or celebrate because now they were dealing with such huge loss and grief. And of course, the father of the family took it the worst, Fred, because not only was he grieving the loss of his wife, but now he was also trying to be a very suddenly single parent. He was trying to care for these two kids and go to work and get money and put food on the table. It was just proving far too difficult for him, and he very quickly ended up handing both of the kids to relatives to take care of. This was only supposed to be temporary, just until Fred kind of earned a little bit more money and got himself a little bit more stable, and then he was planning to bring his kids back and be a family again. So the kids were split up. Winifred was sent to go and live with her father's parents, so her paternal grandparents, and Graham was sent to go and live with his auntie Winnie, which was his dad's sister. And this was the situation for 3 years. So for the first 3 years of Graham's life, he is being raised by his auntie Winnie, and he was pretty much separated from his father and his sister. He would see his father here and there, because of course it's his sister, so he would go over to visit, but they weren't a family. But then in 1950, Fred met a new woman, a woman named Molly, just like his last wife. But he fell in love with Molly and the two of them married. And now that he had a wife and a stable family and a home again, he felt like he was finally ready to bring back his two kids. So that's exactly what they did. And they were a family again. And Molly really took on these two kids as if they were her own. She was, honestly, from what I could tell in my research, she was a wonderful stepmother. She really, really got on with the kids at first, especially Winifred, because she was a little bit older. She was like going into her teens at this point, and they would like go out together. And well, to be fair, she would take both the kids out all the time, especially because Fred was working a lot. So Molly would be home with the kids during the day. They became really, really close. But as the two children aged, it became very apparent that Winifred and Graham were not alike at all. Winifred was a very normal teenage girl. She was outgoing, she was social, she was kind and polite, she was into all the usual things that little girls are into, you know, like dolls and I don't know, other stuff. But Graham was like the exact opposite. He was shy, reserved, quiet. And when he did get speaking, he was quite an oddball. Like, he was quite socially awkward, and the things that he was interested in talking about were things that not many people are interested in talking about. I realise I'm probably saying this to the wrong audience, but he was very into true crime and serial killers, but think how old he is. He's like 10. And I think when we were 10, even though we're interested in it now, maybe when we were 10, we might have looked at someone like, that's a bit weird. Why are you so into serial killers? I don't know why or how he was getting access to those books at that age. I don't know if his parents just didn't care that he was reading that. I don't think I would want my 10-year-old reading scary stuff like that. He had fixations on a couple of criminals in particular that he was almost like a stan of. Like, he would write about them in his notebooks, he would research them, like he was a genuine fan. So there was Dr. Hawley Crippen, who poisoned and killed his own wife in 1910. Graham was really interested in him, and another poisoner called the Rugeley Poisoner. His name was William Palmer, and he was accused of doing a whole bunch of different poisonings of like loads of people that were close to him, his family, his friends, and it was believed that it was also that he could get life insurance policy money. Both of which were British, by the way, British poisoner killers. really niche interest to have. But Graham's morbid and weird interests didn't start and end with true crime. He was also very interested, very fascinated by the Nazi regime and World War II and Adolf Hitler. It all started when they started learning about it at school in history class, as you do. And he just became very fixated on it, and it became obsessive, again, to the point where he was almost like a fan. He started wearing swastikas, like, on his clothes. He would wear the armband. So that's the kind of kid we're talking about right now. He didn't have that many friends. These interests were things that he just indulged in when he was alone in his bedroom. But outside of his very questionable interests, Graham Young was a very intelligent child. He got really good grades in all of his subjects across the board, but specifically science, because he loved science. He was so interested in it, would spend a lot of his free time just like doing further reading. He was particularly into chemistry, like the chemistry part of science class. He was so interested in like mixing different chemicals and finding out what they make, and then how the properties of it change when you mix it with different things. It is quite fascinating, to be fair. So much so that his father bought him a chemistry set for like Christmas or his birthday or something one year. And when I tell you he got his use out of this chemistry kit, he was using it for years and years and years. He would also like nick off with all his mum's like beauty products, his stepmom's beauty products, and like nail varnish remover and stuff like that. And he would read all the chemical content on the back and learn all these really long names of chemicals. Like, he was just really into chemistry. When Graham turned 12 years old, he moved up to high school, and he actually went to a grammar school. Why did I say it like that? Grammar school, which is for the smarter kids over here in the UK. You have to pass like a specific exam to be let into a grammar school, so that says a lot about his grades. And of course, because it is a bit more of an advanced school, they have a bit more like advanced reading. The library in his high school was stocked with so many like really good textbooks in every single subject, but he was mostly interested in the chemistry ones. The more he read of like all these different science books, the more he realized that toxicology specifically was his thing. He was so interested in toxicology, which is more so looking at how these different chemicals can be toxic or harmful to certain living organisms. I nearly said the other word then. So the stuff that Graham was mainly reading up on were like medicine and drug studies, you know, the ones that are like tested on humans, and it says which dosages give what kind of side effects and symptoms and stuff like that. He was really into all these, like, reading about all these trials. And one day, Graham decides that he wants to get his hands on some of these substances and have a bit of an experiment of his own. So he's 13 years old at this point in the case, and he toddles on down to the chemist and asks for these particular types of chemicals that he wants. And the chemist looks at him and he's like, "No, you're a kid." But then Graham used his very advanced toxicology knowledge to his advantage. So he lied and said that he was 17, he just looks young, and that he was actually studying toxicology at one of the local schools, and he needed these chemicals for his studies, for his experiments. Him and the chemist had like quite a lengthy conversation about these different chemicals, and Graham managed to like prove his knowledge. He seemed like he could have been a university student, and so in the end, I think this chemist was a bit dodgy anyway. He just ended up selling this 13-year-old a bunch of harmful, toxic chemicals. He was able to buy like quite large quantities of 3 different chemicals: digitalis, arsenic, and antimony. And within just a few weeks of Graham secretly purchasing these chemicals, his family started to fall very suddenly and severely ill. It was like a stomach bug that they were all experiencing. Actually, it was his stepmother Molly that was hit first. She was vomiting, she had diarrhea, she had excruciating stomach pain. So it hit Molly first, and then it hit Fred, and then it hit Winifred, and then it actually hit Graham. And as time went by, none of them really seemed to be recovering from this stomach bug. If anything, it was getting a little bit worse. Even a few of the kids that Graham went to school with were contracting contracting what seemed to be this really nasty virus. By now, Molly had been suffering the longest, and she also had the most severe symptoms. She was now experiencing hair loss, and because she'd been vomiting that much, she couldn't keep any food down, so she was losing weight drastically. And until this point, they'd been explaining these symptoms away with loads of different things, like, oh, maybe they'd eaten something bad, and then maybe they thought it was a bug or just a really bad virus. But now it was clear that it was way more than that. It wasn't getting any better, and it was getting worse, a million times worse by the week. And then Graham's older sister Winifred was struck particularly badly with symptoms one day when she was on the train to work. She started getting really faint. I think she collapsed. She was having hallucinations. She had to be rushed to hospital, actually. At the hospital, she was checked over. They did a bunch of tests on her, and her blood test was very revealing. She had traces of belladonna in her system, and if you don't know what that is, it's the deadly nightshade plant. It's super toxic, poisonous to humans. There's no way that someone could ever really accidentally ingest belladonna. Like, if you're living a normal life, like me or you, there's no way that you're accidentally eating a little bit of this toxic, deadly plant. Immediately, the doctors are thinking that Winifred has been targeted. Someone has intentionally poisoned her. So they started asking her, well, do you know anyone that could have done this to you? Anyone that might want to do this to you? And she was really shocked. Of course not. Like, she had no conflict going on in her life. She couldn't understand why someone would want to intentionally poison her and try and kill her. So she started thinking of some potential opportunities that someone might have had to have done this. And then she remembered earlier that morning, she accepted a cup of tea off of her younger brother, Graham. And actually, now that she was thinking about it, she remembered she only had one mouthful of this cup of tea, and it was really bitter, so she ended up, like, I think just spitting the rest out, leaving the rest. She didn't think much of it at the time. I don't think you would. You'd probably just think, like, the milk's gone sour or something, or my brother just makes a really shit cup of tea. She had no idea that it was actually laced with poison. But that seemed like the only explanation, and quite a good explanation at that, because the family knew that Graham was weirdly obsessed with, like, chemicals and chemistry and doing all these, like, little experiments. He was always doing it. So it made sense. So Fred goes home really, really angry with his son. He pulls Graham to the side and he confronts him, saying, how could you do this to your sister? How could you poison her like that? And Graham's denying it. He says he has nothing to do with it. He said he would never do anything like that to his sister. But he did tell his father that he had an idea of how it could have happened. He said that he'd seen Winifred playing with shampoos and shower gels in the family tea set, like a few days prior, and he was like, oh, she probably just didn't wash it all out properly and she's like poisoned herself. But like, realistically, okay, so this girl is like in her mid-teens, and I'm not judging your hobbies or what you like to do for fun, but are we really making like potions in tea sets in our mid-teens? That's something you do when you're like 6. Not only that, the chemicals and stuff in shampoos wouldn't. They're not belladonna. They know exactly what chemical has poisoned her. It's belladonna. They don't put belladonna in shampoo and conditioner. It weren't making sense. But it was just kind of like his word against hers, really, isn't it? Fred just wasn't really buying it, and so he went up to Graham's bedroom and he starts looking around, searching the whole place for belladonna, but he didn't find anything. There was nothing that he saw anywhere. Whether Graham had managed to hide anything, we don't know, but Fred didn't find anything on that day. At this point in time, Fred did still think that Graham was responsible for his sister's poisoning, but he didn't think it was intentional. So he thought that maybe Graham could have been doing his like chemistry experiments and stuff in the tea set and then not washed it out properly. This has happened, and now he panics and like is trying to deny it. But maybe he did it by accident. So Fred gave Graham a final warning saying, be careful with those chemicals because look what you've done to your sister. And that was kind of where this whole thing was left. But Graham didn't stop messing with those chemicals. As I'm sure you have probably guessed, he was the one making his family deadly ill with this terrible stomach bug. First his stepmother Molly, then his father, then his sister Winifred, and then at points he was getting symptoms too. And people don't know whether he was intentionally poisoning himself to make it seem less suspicious. I don't believe that, personally. Wait until you hear the rest of the case. He doesn't do that. I think what the case could actually be is like unintentional poisoning. He could have, like, I don't know, poisoned a family food or a family drink and then had to have a little bit because everyone else was having some, or maybe he, like, just didn't rinse out a cup properly. Something like that. I don't think it was intentional, though. That's just my opinion. But yeah, he'd been poisoning his family's tea for months, and they'd all just been blaming it on this stomach bug. He didn't even have to try and cover anything up because they were coming up with an excuse for this illness. His main victim was his stepmother, Molly, for some reason. I don't know why she was the one that he started with, and I don't know why she was the one that he was the most severe with, but for some reason she was his main test subject. In fact, now I'm thinking of it, I didn't think this as I was researching, but now I've realised maybe it was so that he could properly observe her symptoms, because that's what he really liked about toxicology was the experiment of it, and like the tests and the trials and giving a subject this dosage of this thing and seeing how they reacted. So maybe that's why he started with Molly, who was a stay-at-home stepmother, because he just spent the most time with her and she was the most easy to observe. Possibly. Sorry, I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent then, but that's because I got excited. I didn't think of that in my research, and I've just thought of that now. But yeah, like I said, he started with his stepmother Molly, and it was the most severe with her as well. And he'd been gradually increasing her dosage over the last few months. He increased it by a little bit every week, and this had been going on for months. And at this point, Molly had started building a bit of a resistance, a bit of a tolerance to this chemical. And so she wasn't really getting increased symptoms. She was still struggling. She still had vomiting and diarrhea, but it wasn't getting any worse. The symptoms were just kind of staying the same, even though he was upping the dosage. And this was quite frustrating to Graham, because he'd actually been making notes this whole time on like the dosages he'd been giving her and the way that she'd been reacting, how long it took her to react, you know, all that kind of stuff. He was doing full-on science experiments on his family, poisoning them to see how they would react. He'd been noting it all down, and for the last few weeks, because her symptoms hadn't been getting any worse, his notes had been pretty boring, and he was getting frustrated with this. He needed some development, some movement. Then on April 21st, 1962, Fred returned home from the pub one evening to find his wife, Molly, in the back garden, hunched over in pain. She was absolutely wailing. She was holding her stomach, she was crying, she eventually collapsed to the ground, and that was when Fred called her an ambulance and got her transported to hospital. But shortly after arriving, Molly passed away. The doctors concluded that Molly's cause of death was actually a hidden injury that she'd sustained from a car crash that she'd been in a few weeks prior. She had like a problem with one of her discs in her spine, I believe, like a prolapsed disc. And she hadn't really realised it at the time, but it had been doing more and more damage as the weeks had been going by, and by this point it must, I don't know, how does a disc do something like that? I don't know, but that's what they concluded she died of anyway. But either way, they were wrong. That wasn't how Molly died, and unfortunately they didn't find out how she actually died because they didn't do a toxicology report on her. To be fair, why would they when they think she's just died randomly at her house from some sort of injury? They didn't do a toxicology report on her, so they didn't see that she had insane levels of poison in her system. Her own stepson had been poisoning her for months gradually, and when he grew tired that he wasn't seeing the results that he wanted to, he went out and got a much stronger, much more toxic chemical to put in her tea. When his father went out to the pub that night, Graham laced his stepmother's tea with a large amount of thallium, like a freaking lot, enough to kill multiple people. Later that night when Fred returned home from the pub, before he actually made it to the back garden and found Molly in pain, he passed the front window and saw his son, Graham, standing at the window, smiling, waving at his dad. He seemed really excited, which of course Fred didn't think anything of at the time. That's his son and he's just come home. Kids do tend to get excited when their parents come home. But now it seemed really, really odd that he must have known that Molly was out writhing in pain in the garden, dying, and he's excitedly jumping and waving and smiling in the window. And what's even scarier is that he knew it was too late for anyone to save her. He knew that his father was about to walk back there and find the woman that he loves dying. Every single angle of this is so effed. So when Molly did pass away, Graham was actually the first member of the family to bring up the inevitable funeral. I mean, everyone knows it's going to have to happen, but brought it up very quickly. And he was very adamant that they should cremate her, just because that's, you know, the better option when someone passes away. We should cremate her. And Graham, for a kid, was very, very smart, because he knew why he wanted to cremate her. To get rid of her body, to get rid of the evidence that he had poisoned her and killed her. If they cremated the body, there's no way that they would ever be able to do tests if anyone was ever suspicious. And Fred agreed that cremating the body would be the best thing to do. And so 2 weeks later, when the funeral happened, that is what they did. They cremated the body. But even at the funeral, Graham was still being an evil little mastermind. At the wake, he laced one of the dips, I think it was like a spread or like a mustard relish thing. He laced it with some sort of chemical, I don't know which one specifically, but he was trying to poison everyone at his stepmother's funeral. It made quite a few members of the family ill. Like a couple of them had to run off to the toilet. A lot of them had stomach aches that day. It wasn't enough to kill anyone or even leave them like seriously ill, but it was enough to give them an upset tummy. Give a lot of people an upset tummy. Most of the family were pretty much recovered from this mysterious illness. Again, it seemed like a stomach bug had broken out at the funeral, and a lot of the family members were getting over it in the coming days. But not Fred. Fred, in fact, seemed to be getting worse. His symptoms just kept worsening and worsening over the next few days, and then after a week or two, it got so bad that he actually had to take himself to the hospital. And once he was there, they did all these tests and all these, analyses, and they came to a conclusion. They told Fred Young that they think he is being intentionally poisoned by someone. Doctors said he was actually only about 1 or 2 doses away from dying. He had high levels of antimony in his system, and had he left this any longer, he would have probably died. He came to the hospital right in the nick of time. Fred immediately had his suspicions of his son. I mean, he practically knew it was his son. And so as soon as he was recovered and discharged from the hospital, he didn't go straight away and go and speak to Graham. Actually, first he went to go and speak to his sister. Do you remember Aunt Winnie that Graham went to go and stay with for the first 3 years of his life? Well, Fred and his sister Winnie were really, really close, and they went to each other with a lot of things. And so Fred kind of needed some help on how to go about this. He has just found out that his son is intentionally poisoning him and making him ill. And now this situation is making him think, like, beyond just that one incident, he's now thinking of the stomach bugs everyone's been having, his own wife's death. Everything is starting to connect and make sick sense. And it was around this same time, actually, before his dad had said or done anything, that Graham's school teachers were also getting a little bit suspicious of him. Because obviously he was very, very, very into chemistry and poisons, and he was always asking his chemistry teacher about it all the time. So much so that he realised it was a very morbid obsession, like a fixation with Graham, and over time he was getting more and more concerned about him, to the point where his science teacher once went and searched Graham's desk. I think this was like back in the day where they had them like fold up desks. So he goes over and has a look inside, and in there he finds poison in Graham Young's school desk. There were a couple of different vials of different substances. There was also a bunch of notebooks in there that he'd been taking notes about poisons in. That was pretty much the only thing he ever wrote about, just different information about different chemicals he was finding and these different like killers that he idolized, these infamous poisoners. It was very clear what was going on here, and everyone was very, very concerned about Graham Young. He was still very young, maybe only like a preteen, or maybe he was like 13, maybe 14 at this time. Young, anyway, around that age. And I believe it was his school teacher that called the police on Graham. And the police came down to speak to the teacher, and they decided that since he is still very, very young and this could just be, just a wrong path that he's going down, they decided to take a bit of a softer route into this. They weren't going to arrest him and immediately be accusatory and everything. they decided that they were going to bring in a psychiatrist to kind of give him a bit of an evaluation, because if he was mentally ill, then they needed to go about this a different way. But of course, they didn't want him to know that he was getting a psychiatric evaluation, because they didn't want him to know that police were onto him. So they had a plan. They sent in this psychiatrist. They sent in a psychiatrist as like a careers advisor. She was meant to sit down with Graham and kind of talk to him about his future prospects and what he might want to be one day when he grows up. So she comes in and she chats to him, and immediately he starts going on about his love for toxicology and poisons and all that, because he thinks it's a careers meeting and he wants a career in it, and he's talking about how much he knows about this one and like all these different chemicals. He's naming them all and saying how toxic these ones are, and she's sat there hearing all of this. Obviously she knows why she's there, because he's being accused of like intentionally poisoning and almost killing people. Not only that, he was also showing just quite an egotistical element to his personality. He liked to be the most intelligent and knowledgeable one in the room. Didn't matter what subject, but especially chemistry, especially toxicology. He liked people to know that he knew more than them, and he liked to prove that. He liked to make sure they knew that. And that's one of the things that really did him in this career advisor meeting, was that he was bragging about how much more he knew about toxicology and poisons than the rest of his class. And this was exactly what the psychiatrist needed to go back to the police and say, yep, this boy is a danger to society. I definitely think he's responsible for something here. And so that same day, they went and arrested Graham Young at his auntie's house. They took him down to the police station, and when they searched him, they found that he literally had vials of like these chemicals in his shirt pocket. He was just carrying these on his person at all times. They'd caught him red-handed with this, and there was no way out of it. And so Graham just confessed that he had been poisoning people. He'd been poisoning his own family, his whole family at that, and even a boy that he'd befriended in school. This boy was Graham's like only friend. Like I said, he wasn't social, he was quite a loner. And so he would spend most of his lunch times with this one particular boy. They would swap sandwiches every now and again, and I think Graham spotted an opportunity in this. I think on one occasion he had laced his own sandwich with some sort of poison and then asked to swap them, and that's how he poisoned his friend. I think his friend was hospitalised but did eventually recover. But despite all of these confessions, confessing to poisoning his father, his sister, his school friend, he still wasn't admitting anything about his mother's death, his stepmother's death. Naturally, the police did suspect him of having something to do with it. Of course, it was too similar to everything else that Graham was currently doing. It seemed like it was in keeping with his current pattern. But because her body had been cremated at her funeral, they had absolutely no way of proving anything. They had no evidence, they had nothing to test. And so despite police believing that he did kill his stepmother, they couldn't really do anything about it. They couldn't charge him with anything. But instead, he was charged with a few counts of administering poisons, I think. I don't know, I think the actual charge is a bit more wordy than that. But he got charged for poisoning. So this case was due to go to trial, and before it did, they brought in a psychiatrist to give him an assessment to see if, obviously the first one was kind of disguised as a careers meeting, so she hadn't been able to ask proper questions to be able to diagnose him. It was just more of a vague assessment. They just wanted to get an idea. But now they needed to actually see if he was mentally ill. Following this assessment, Graham was diagnosed with psychopathic disorder. It was deemed that he felt no guilt or remorse for anything he'd ever done, harming people, potentially killing people, because they believed that he killed his stepmother, although they just didn't have the proof. And the psychiatrist that assessed him firmly believed that he would keep doing this. There was no sign of him stopping or wanting to stop at any point. In fact, when the case did go to court, the prosecution argued that this obsession and fixation that he had on poisons was not something that was just going to go away with age. It wasn't just like a childish fixation, like a phase that he was going through. It seemed like it was something that was very deeply ingrained into him for some reason. Whether it was due to his mental illness or what, it just seemed like something that was not going to shake with time or with age or maturity or anything. The psychiatrist even told the court a specific quote from the assessment. So this is something that Graham said, and it is so eerie. He said, "I'm missing my antimony. I miss the power it gives me." Which tells you a lot about his mental state towards these poisonings, I think. A lot of it is a power thing, possibly relating back to his childhood. Maybe he felt like he didn't have power or control over anything, and this is a way that he has found to have power and control over the people around him. Eventually, he did plead guilty to all of these charges of poisoning his dad, his sister, his school friend, and for all of that, he was sentenced to 15 years in Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Broadmoor is the most infamous psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane over here in the UK. We've talked about it in so many videos at this point. So many infamous serial killers, serial rapists, terrorists, literally the worst of the worst, people that they know will likely reoffend if they're allowed out in the world. They're the kind of people that they send to Broadmoor. And actually, bear in mind, Graham Young is really young at the time. He was 14 years old when he was sent to Broadmoor, and at the time he was the youngest patient ever to have gone to Broadmoor. These days there's been a few younger than him. I think Sharon Carr was younger than him. She was like 12. When Graham first arrived, they did a whole bunch more psychiatric assessments on him, and he was also diagnosed with schizophrenia alongside his psychopathic disorder. And for the first couple of months, life at Broadmoor was fine. Graham seemed to be getting on alright. His family would come to visit him regularly, but they quickly got quite frustrated with him because whenever they would go and see him, they would try and have conversations with him, but all he was interested in was asking them to try and smuggle him in some poison or even some matches. And they were quite confused why he wanted matches so bad, because he'd never been like a fire guy. It was more like a poison guy. So they were quite confused why he wanted matches. But it quickly became clear that there is a way to I don't know what element it is. Element? Chemical? Oh, you can tell I got a B in my chemistry GCSE. So there's something in matches that you can extract, and it's poisonous to humans. Turns out that's why he wanted the matches. He didn't want them for match purposes, fire purposes. He wanted them for poison purposes. Clearly, being in Broadmoor wasn't doing much for his mental state, since he was very much still in the mindset of wanting to poison everyone around him at all times. It was clearly all he could think about day in, day out. That was all that was on his mind, was when the next opportunity to poison someone would be. He kind of described it almost like a drug addiction, but obviously he wasn't the one doing the drugs, but he was craving administering those drugs to someone else without them knowing. Odd. So yeah, his family felt quite uncomfortable with the visits now. They thought they were kind of being used. He wasn't really interested in talking to them if they weren't going to give him, if they weren't going to smuggle in poisons for him to kill people inside the hospital. So they're starting to go see him less and less. Obviously they weren't going to take him any poison, but Graham Young managed to find a way to get some. There were a number of smaller suspected poisoning incidents in the first few months that Graham was there, but for some reason, in all these little incidents, poisoning couldn't be proven. So they've never been attributed to Graham Young, but I think it's interesting to mention that he turns up and suddenly people get ill around him. And then one day, one of his fellow patients, a man named John Berridge, just suddenly dropped dead, and an autopsy revealed that he had been poisoned with cyanide. Of course, Graham was everyone's prime suspect. Inmates and staff alike were all side-eyeing him, being like, okay, I wonder who has poisoned this man to death. Maybe it's the serial poisoner in the prison. It's not prison, it's a hospital. The serial poisoner in Broadmoor. So they're trying to investigate it, and obviously Graham's not just coming out and admitting yeah, I poisoned him and killed him. But he can't keep his mouth shut for too long because, like I said, he had a massive ego. He liked people to know how intelligent he was, and he liked people to know all this shit that he was getting up to. He couldn't keep it to himself for very long. He eventually ends up bragging to some of the other inmates that he had figured out how to extract something from the laurel bushes that they had in the yards at the hospital so that he could what's the word? He could distill it into cyanide. Forgive me if the science is wrong, like I said, B in chemistry GCSE, but he'd figured out how to derive poison from the plants on the hospital yard. How crazy is that they've essentially supplied that? Well, obviously not with their knowledge, but that's still crazy. But this is quite an interesting turn of events. John Berridge, that dropped dead from cyanide poisoning, his death was actually ruled as a suicide. No further investigations were done from that point. His death was ruled a suicide. Graham Young never saw any punishment. No one ever was officially able to prove that he had done anything, to be fair. And a lot of people that have looked into this case think that this could be a cover-up from the hospital, them just labelling it a suicide so that people wouldn't ask too many questions. And this could be for a couple of reasons. And this goes back to having the plants in the yard. Maybe they were just trying to save face, because realistically, they shouldn't have plants in the yard that a serial poisoner can extract poison from. That is crazy. Someone should have done a risk assessment. So maybe they were just trying to save face on that front, because it's technically their fault that they provided these plants in the yard and then one of the inmates was able to kill one of the other inmates with them. Maybe that. It's just really frustrating that they didn't take the suspicions seriously at the time. They didn't properly look into this, because Graham only continued to poison people again and again throughout his life. Had he been stopped here, had this been investigated properly, then who knows? He might not have gone on to do anything that we're about to talk about with the rest of this case. I have a theory that those laurel bushes were ripped out of the yard, because after this point, Graham never managed to get access to cyanide again, and surely if the bushes were still there, he would just go right back to them and extract it again. I think the hospital must have known what had happened here. They must have realised that he'd got the cyanide from the bushes, ripped out the bushes, and then this never happened again. He'd never found cyanide again. So to me, that says that the bushes were gone. I have no evidence of that theory, but it just makes sense to me. But he did carry on trying to poison everyone, staff, other inmates, patients, with whatever he could get his hands on, just household cleaning products, bleach even. Oh, and also going back to his weird Nazi obsession, at this point he was growing into an older teenager and he was starting to grow facial hair. Can you see where this is going? He shaved himself a toothbrush mustache in so that he could look exactly like Adolf Hitler. While he was in Broadmoor, this interest of his was really kicking it up a gear. And I don't understand why the staff didn't kind of have their eye on that a bit more. Is that not a red flag? He was always reading about the Nazis and always talking about them to anyone that would listen. He would do pretend speeches as if he was Hitler. Is this not the biggest red flag you've ever heard? He would also exclusively listen to music from Hitler's favourite composer, which isn't a red flag in itself, but I think it's just a bit funny. But despite all these very concerning traits that didn't seem to be subsiding with medication or therapy or age or time or being separated from his environment, literally nothing was changing the whole time he was in Broadmoor, which is concerning. If you're sent to a psychiatric hospital for something, you should be making progress over time, but he really wasn't. And despite the fact that he was not making progress, somehow, Graham Young was released from Broadmoor early. He was sentenced to 15 years minimum, but somehow he was let out after 9, when he was 23 years old. The doctors signed off that he was fully recovered and he was no longer a danger to society, and God, were they wrong. When Graham found out that he was going to be released, he actually said to one of the nurses, and this is an exact quote, "When I get out, I'm going to kill one person for every year I've spent in this place." And the most frustrating thing is that this comment was actually recorded on his file. The nurse reported it, it was written on his file, but then for some reason, when it came to deciding to release him early, how could they read that comment and think, yeah, just let him out anyway? What? So yeah, Graham was released from Broadmoor in 1971. He was 23 years old, and when he got out, none of his family wanted anything to do with him. Of course, he'd been poisoning all of them. None of them wanted to be close with him at all. But his sister Winifred did kind of take pity on him. She realised that he genuinely didn't have anyone, and he'd been locked away from society for all of his teenage years, and now he was just kind of let out into the world as an adult and forced to just try and, like, I don't know, figure it out. She felt bad. He is a little brother at the end of the day, and so she said to him that he could come and stay with her and her husband, because by now she had her life sorted. She had her life settled down. She had a husband. I think she could have had kids. Actually, I don't think she had kids at this point. But she had her life together, and she was willing to let her little brother, that had tried to poison her and kill her a few years ago, by the way, she let him into their house. She trusted him around their kitchen. She must have really believed he'd changed, which, to be fair, they all had reason to believe that he'd changed, because all of these professionals, all these doctors and psychiatrists had signed off on that fact. They'd said that he's recovered, he's no longer a danger to society. So his sister was just believing what professionals said. So at this point in time, Graham is living in Hemel Hempstead with his sister and her husband. Hemel Hempstead is just like north of London. It's just a bit out of London. And I'm sure you guessed what was going to happen. Within just a few months of him being out of Broadmoor Hospital, Graham Young was already looking to get his hands on poison again. But now he was back with a vengeance. It's as if being like locked away for the last 9 years and been deprived of poison had made him desperate for it, and now he was about to be more dangerous than ever. He tried to get some poison from the chemist, just like last time, just through like charm and deceit and lies. But this didn't work like it did last time. Last time he was able to just blag his way through it. But this time the chemist was like, "Nah, mate, sorry, I cannot sell you anything without like proper authorization, like an actual letter." So Graham went off and he like forged this university letter. He just made some random header of a university that existed in the area and wrote a fake letter from his professor saying that he needed these chemicals for a specific experiment that they were doing. He took it down to the chemist, and the chemist was like, "Okay, cool." And he gave him these poisonous toxins again. So now he had a whole load of antimony, which is something that he's been using the whole time, but now he also had thallium, which I believe is even more toxic than like pretty much anything he'd been using to date. But in the meantime, he is trying to kind of live as much of a normal life as he can whilst being obsessed with poisons. Because like I said, he'd been locked away from the world all his teenage years. He's now just trying to like navigate being an adult. So he eventually ended up moving out of his sister's house, and he just moved into a hostel, I think, in Hemel Hempstead. And he started a shopkeeping course as well to give himself a bit of a vocation. He planned to go on and become a shopkeeper. But wherever Graham Young went, trouble, illness, and death just seemed to follow him. And so a lot of the people that he shared the hostel with became ill. A lot of people on his course also became ill. It was like he was a walking stomach bug. One of the worst cases was one of the men that he shared the hostel with, 34-year-old Trevor Sparks. And the two of these men had gotten really close, by the way, because they were living together. They spent a lot of time together. They would go out to the pub together on evenings. They would even play football in the park together with a few other men. They would just chill together in the hostel even sometimes. They would go to the shop, buy drinks, take them back to the hostel and just chill and talk. And the two of them got pretty close. That was until Trevor suddenly became violently ill. It just happened so suddenly, as had all the others. He just woke up one day and he was projectile vomiting. He was diarrheaing. Oh my God. I could have said that in a much nicer way, but I'm gonna leave it. He had shooting pains in his legs. He had actually a really odd combination of symptoms. So the usual ones with vomiting, diarrhea, but now he's got like shooting pains in his legs and also an intense pain in his testicles. It was a really weird combination of symptoms, and even Trevor acknowledged that. He was like, "What the hell is going on with my body?" But to be fair, after like a day or so, it kind of subsided. So he just kind of looked at it like, "That was weird, but I guess I'm fine now," and life just carried on. That was until a few days later when the exact same set of weird symptoms all hit him all at once, again, just like last time. But because they'd subsided once before, Trevor was like, it's fine, I'll just endure it for a day or two and then they'll be gone, just like last time. And they did. The symptoms went again. And this happened over and over again. I would say like 3, maybe 4 times. He would get these really odd combination of symptoms and then it'd go a couple of days later. That was until one particularly bad day when these symptoms hit him in the middle of a game of football. He was out at the park playing football with some mates when he literally had to sit out the rest of the game. He was in so much pain. Trevor had been to the doctors multiple times about this specific set of symptoms. And because obviously he was desperate for a cure. It's really affecting his life at this point in time. But the doctors just couldn't really figure out what was wrong with him. I mean, they kept thinking they knew what it was. They would diagnose him with something and then they would realise it's not actually that, and they would diagnose him with something else. He was misdiagnosed like 4 or 5 times, which is insane. At first they thought it could be a UTI. They also thought it was like an infection in his kidneys. They thought it could be a bowel infection at one point. What else was there? I don't know, there were a few other things and I haven't written them down. But I know that there was more than that. And every single time they would put him on some sort of treatment for whatever infection they thought he had, and the treatment would do nothing. So he would go back to the doctors and then they'd be like, oh wait, yeah, it's because it's this other thing. They still had no idea what this was because it is such a specific set of symptoms. Something must be affecting so many different parts of this man. In April of that year, Trevor actually moved out of that hostel and he never had one of those attacks ever again. Ever. He'd only shared that hostel with Graham for like 2 months. I think Graham joined in like late February, maybe early March. So maybe it hadn't even been 2 whole months. But he'd had so many of these attacks. Luckily, he managed to get out of this alive. He managed to know Graham Young and survive it. But he did have some lasting problems from the poisoning. I think it was particularly with his legs. I read a few different sources on this. Some of them said that he was paralysed. Some of them just said that his legs just are not very good since all these attacks, so he can't really play football and stuff anymore. I don't know exactly where on that scale it is, but to whatever degree, the fact that this has had long-lasting, lifelong effects on this man is so sad. Graham Young later confessed to poisoning Trevor with antimony this whole time. I'm sure you detectives had figured that out by now though. So now that his latest test subject had moved away, Graham decided to move on with his life. He finished up his shopkeeping course and he actually moved back to Hemel Hempstead to be closer to his sister, but he didn't move back in with her. He got like a house share, so he was renting a bedroom and they all shared like the communal areas, the living room, kitchen and stuff. And he never let anyone in his bedroom, not any of his housemates, none of his friends. I don't think he really had that many friends, to be honest, but no one was ever allowed in his bedroom. And that's because inside his bedroom, he was really expressing his morbid interests. There were posters all over his walls of Hitler and the Nazis. There were swastikas drawn everywhere. It genuinely looks like something out of a horror film. But no one knew that that was there until like quite a while later when eventually his bedroom was found and everyone was like, not surprised really. So now Graham is looking for a job. He goes and applies for a job at this laboratory. It was literally just for like a little assistant role. He was just going to be like, they were going to train him up on the job, but when he first got there, his basic jobs was just going to be like answering phones, taking notes, making cups of tea for people. Dangerous. So anyway, he applies for the job at this laboratory and the person giving him the job interview had quite a few questions about his patchy history because he had to disclose on his CV that he'd been in Broadmoor for a while, and they asked him about it and he was like, yeah, look, my mum died when I was young and I had a bit of a mental breakdown and I didn't do well. I was sent to the hospital. They looked after me and now I'm grown, I am well again and I'm ready to get back out there in the world. And this laboratory that was looking at hiring him really had no reason not to believe that. Like, that's not something that people really tend to lie about. This man was sat in front of them saying, I had a really, really hard time when I was a teenager. I was hospitalised. And he is like offering up this information, you know? They're not gonna sit there and go, I don't believe you, because they'd be awful people. So they didn't. They just took his word for it, because you would. This employer could actually get their hands on some discharge notes from Broadmoor, I think. But annoyingly, in these notes, it didn't actually say why he was in Broadmoor. It just said he was in there, he struggled, he's been medicated, and he's been through therapy, and now they believe him to be mentally stable and fit to go out in the world. It said nothing specific. So this employer has no idea what Graham has done in his past and what he is capable of. So he was offered this job at the lab. And like I said, he was kind of at the bottom of the pecking order. He was doing all the shit little runaround jobs, tidying up, making cups of teas. That is literally the worst job they could have given this man, but considering they had not even so much as a hint from Broadmoor Hospital about what this guy was capable of, they let him make everyone's cups of tea. So, Graham Young starts his job at this laboratory, and he is laying low for a while. He's gaining everyone's trust, he's making friends. He doesn't do anything for a little while. He's just kind of finding his feet. He's learning how this company operates, who's above who has the power. And one thing he very quickly learned after he joined was that everyone had their own specific mug for their tea. No one ever swapped mugs, they always just had it in the same cup. And this was going to help him a lot later when it came to targeting individual victims. So, once he'd gained a little bit of confidence, he starts poisoning his fellow employees. Ones that might have pissed him off a bit that day, ones that he just generally found quite annoying and unbearable. He would slip them a little bit of poison in their tea. Not enough to do any serious damage, but enough to make them ill, maybe even enough to send them home for the day or for a day or two. Over time, he was increasing these doses, increasing them, until people started having to have like days off work at a time. And it started to look as though there was a stomach bug going around the office because loads of people were falling ill with the same symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, having a few days off here and there. It looked like something was contagious and being passed around the office. And it even got to a point where, like, people would have this bug, they would be off work, they would recover, they would come back to work, and then within a couple of weeks, they would have caught it again off of another one of their co-workers who still had the bug. So people were falling, like, it was just a cycle. They were falling ill with this same bug, so much so that this stomach bug became quite infamous within the town. The town where this laboratory was called Bovingdon, and the bug became known as the Bovingdon bug. And it was more so like just an inside joke within the company. It wasn't really talked about much outside of this laboratory. Well, at all, really. It wasn't throughout the town. But like all the staff would joke with each other about how they're all continuously passing it to each other and like, oh, stay away from me, you've got the Bovingdon bug, stuff like that. So that was kind of the theory of all the staff at the laboratory. They just thought it was a virus. But there was another theory that a couple of people had, that maybe it was something wrong with the water supply at the laboratory. Like, maybe something was getting in there that shouldn't have been and it was making them all ill. But in reality, it was Graham Young poisoning everyone's tea and no one noticed at all. In fact, everyone kind of liked Graham. He wasn't that much of a talkative guy. He never really was, unless it was something he was really interested in. And you know the kind of stuff he's really interested in. It's only like morbid stuff like serial killers and the war and the Nazis and stuff. He could talk for hours and hours about those kind of things, but like small talk about the weather, he was never really joining in those conversations with colleagues. But the ones that made more of an effort with him were like the older men. They kind of took him under their wing as like a, you know, just like their work son. There was this one particular guy called Bob Eagle, or Bob Eggle. I don't know, he's 59 years old anyway, and he's called Bob. Bob was a war veteran, and he'd even been at Dunkirk, which you can already imagine. This lit up Graham Young like a light bulb. As soon as he heard this, he wanted to know all about the war. He was always asking Bob about his like first-hand accounts of the war. He was asking him to recount. What's the right word to use? That he would listen to his stories, basically. But despite him literally befriending this man and getting on with Bob really well, and Bob like taking him under his wing, treating him like a work son, Graham quickly made Bob his first proper victim. Well, he like switched his focus to Bob anyway, which is so sad that this man is helping him in so many different ways and he's being so nice to him, like one of the only people that can sit and have a proper conversation with him, yet Graham is still willing to poison him and try and kill him. So, Graham Young starts doing to Bob Eagle exactly what he'd done to his stepmother Molly. He starts poisoning him a little bit every single day and slowly raising the doses to raise his symptoms until before long, Bob Eagle had the bovingdon bug more often than any other staff member, and he had it more severe than any other staff member as well. And then one day, just like he had with Molly, Graham was growing frustrated that these doses weren't affecting Bob as much as they used to. And then one day, just like with Molly, Graham was growing frustrated that the chemicals were no longer having the same effect on Bob. And so one day, he laces Bob's tea with a fatal dose of thallium. Later that same day, Bob was admitted to hospital, believing he had just a really severe case of the bovingdon bug. But while he was there, Bob's symptoms continued to worsen, and now we're starting to see new symptoms that we've never seen before. He had terrible back pain, he had numbness in certain parts of his body, and it started spreading. Like, over time, he stopped being able to, like, move certain parts of his body. It was reported that his skin was peeling off. He was transferred to the intensive care unit because they just did not know what to do with Bob, and he was being checked on, like, nearly every hour. And Graham would actually call up the hospital and ask for updates on Bob's condition, just pretending to be a concerned co-worker. And when you actually think about it, when you put this into perspective, Graham and Bob have only really known each other a few weeks, maybe a month, and he's calling for regular updates in the hospital. It's just a bit odd, you know? I definitely think it's just because he wanted updates on his poisoning. He wanted to know how it was going. Bob eventually passed away from this mysterious illness. He died in a lot of pain, honestly. And when he did die, doctors concluded that his cause of death was due to a very rare condition named Guillain-Barré syndrome. This was the answer that they settled on because they had looked up a bunch of diseases with very similar symptoms, and this one seemed to fit what Bob was experiencing kind of the most. More so like all the later symptoms that he was experiencing, you know, the numbness and then not being able to move his body, the shooting pains that he was getting in his legs were believed to be because of this. So now Graham Young's current victim was gone, and don't get me wrong, he had still been poisoning other people in the meantime. Even while Bob was in hospital, he was still working on poisoning his other co-workers. There was another older man kind of around Bob's age named Ron Hewitt that Graham turned his attentions to, and Ron was kind of like the perfect victim because he was actually leaving the company in like 2 weeks. He'd already handed in his notice, he was going to be leaving, Graham was never going to have to see him again. In fact, I don't really know what Graham's thought process was here, whether he thought he could just poison him loads and then he would leave the company and then he would never see any repercussions for that, or I don't know if Graham saw this as a challenge. He only had 2 weeks to poison and kill this man. Maybe he took it on as a challenge to see if he could do it before Ron left the company. But yeah, Graham had been poisoning Ron this whole time while Bob had been in hospital. And in fact, Ron was that ill with the bovingdon bug that he didn't even spend much of his final 2 weeks at work. He was sick at home. Ron ended up leaving the company with his life, and as soon as he did leave the company and never went back into that laboratory, he never had the bovingdon bug ever again. So now Bob Eagle and Ron Hewitt are both gone from the company for different reasons, and they were the two people that were above Graham Young. Maybe that's why he targeted them. Maybe he wanted a promotion, because that's what he got. He was now promoted to store manager. This also meant that he was now working with a new pool of co-workers, which meant a new pool of victims. His new superior was a woman named Diane Smart, and he really didn't get on with her. I mean, she was just quite a bossy lady from the sounds of things. She would tell him off if he was doing his job wrong, or she would pull him up if he was being lazy, you know, regular schmegular boss stuff. But whenever she would annoy him or do or say something like that, he would poison her. He would make her a cup of tea and lace it with something toxic. I have a quote from Graham's diary here. It says, "Di irritated me yesterday, so I packed her off with an attack of sickness. I only gave her something to shake her up. I now regret that I didn't give her a larger dose, capable of laying her up for a few days. He was also poisoning a bunch of other co-workers at the same time, one of which being another older man named David Tilson. He made him a cup of tea one day and he laced it with thallium. I think he was trying to kill him because that was, I think, the strongest one he used. He would always bring in the thallium when he was ready to kill someone. And sometimes, right, Graham had been doing this long enough now that he knew that he kind of needed to hide the taste of certain poisons in tea. Some of them were completely tasteless, some of them were not. And sometimes he would make these cups of tea for his co-workers and they would be too bitter, and so they would have one mouthful and then they would leave the rest, which really threw a spanner in Graham's plans, didn't it? So to get around it this time, he made this cup of tea, put his poison in it, and then put a frick load of sugar in it, gave it to David Tilson. He had one mouthful of it and he was like, that is way too sweet. He was like, I'm sorry, mate, like, I've got to leave this sugar drink. And this really frustrated Graham, the fact that he'd even tried to get around it and it still hadn't worked. So now Graham was almost trying to prove a point that he was going to poison David Tilson and he was going to drink it. So a few days later, he went back into the lab with even more thallium. He laced David Tilson's tea and this time he drank all of it. And it was enough to land him in the hospital that same evening. He had all the same symptoms that Bob Eagle initially had. He had chest pains and breathing difficulties, vomiting, diarrhea. He had numbness in his legs. He couldn't really move his legs that well. He was losing hair. And another quite obscure symptom was that his skin was so sensitive to the touch that even like clothes, pajamas, his hospital gown, even his bed sheets were too much when they were touching his skin. So meanwhile, Tilson is in hospital and Graham Young is on the outside and he's a bit frustrated that he hasn't managed to kill David. So he makes a plan to go and finish the job. He decided that he was going to go and visit David in the hospital and take a bottle of brandy laced with even more poison because he knew that David would take some, even though he wasn't really allowed it because he was recovering like from all of this, these awful symptoms. The nurses wouldn't have allowed him to have it. But Graham knew that David would take it anyway and just not tell the nurses, which would be perfect. That's exactly why he chose to lace alcohol, so that David wouldn't snitch and it wouldn't get back to Graham. It wouldn't be traced back to him. But Graham actually never got a chance to visit the hospital because by the time he'd like laced this brandy and he was getting ready to go, David Tilson had already been discharged from hospital. He had pretty much fully recovered, but there was one lasting symptom of his poisoning that would affect him for the rest of his life. He had erectile dysfunction, impotence, and it was supposedly like properly affecting his life. You know, not the kind that is a bit annoying, but there's ways around it. You know what I mean? It was done. It was done out here. And you guys know I'm no scientist, but that sounds like quite an obscure, lasting long-term effect of being poisoned, don't you think? After this particular victim, Graham decides to move on again, this time to a man named Jethro Batt. He made Jethro a laced cup of tea one day, gave him it, he drank a little bit of it and it was way too bitter. So he turned to Graham and he was like, sorry mate, I thank you for the cup of tea, but I can't drink the rest of it, it's way too bitter. And Graham turned to him and joked, oh, what, do you think I'm trying to poison you? The two of them shared a little laugh over it because right now, even though he'd been doing this the whole time he'd been at the company, he was making everyone so ill, still no one suspected Graham Young. So he could be so blatant about his jokes and he could laugh at it with his victims. So just like last time, Graham was determined to actually poison Jethro next. He was going to make him another cup of tea and make sure he drank all of it. And he did. He managed to mask the taste a bit better the second time. Jethro drank the whole thing and ended up in hospital. He had pretty much the exact same symptoms as last time. Stomach and chest pain, vomiting, diarrhea. His hair fell out. His legs were in a lot of pain. It wasn't numbness this time. It was extreme pain. So much so that he actually said he was contemplating suicide. It was that bad that he could not put up with it any longer. He wanted to take his own life. But thankfully, Jethro survived and recovered. almost fully. But again, just like David Tilson, he had one lasting effect of the poisonings: erectile dysfunction. But just as Jethro recovered, another colleague fell dramatically ill. This was just the cycle at the lab at this point. There was always a new co-worker in hospital. This time it was another older man named Fred Biggs, and he had been suffering with the bovingdon bug for a little while at this point. I think he'd had it a couple of times, and now it was getting really quite bad, to the point where in November he too was hospitalized. At the hospital, he deteriorated at a rapid speed. He lost the ability to talk. He lost the ability to help himself breathe. He had to be put on life support to physically force his body to breathe. And just like one of the last times, Graham Young was calling up the hospital every single day, and not even just the hospital. He was calling Fred's wife for updates on his health. How sick and twisted is that? After a few days, Fred's body couldn't hold out any longer, and he passed away with his wife by his side in hospital. It turns out that Graham Young had administered 4 times the lethal dose of thallium in Fred Biggs' tea. He had absolutely no chance of surviving that at all. So at this point, people are starting to raise an eyebrow at this whole bovingdon bug thing. It was so severe now that it wasn't just people having a couple of days off work here and there. Co-workers were being hospitalised on a weekly basis. Someone needed to look into this. So management launched a whole internal investigation in the laboratory. They went and spoke to a lot of the people that had had the bovingdon bug in the past, and they realised some odd little things about it. For example, none of them had ever actually passed the bovingdon bug onto any of their family. So they would catch it at work, supposedly from a colleague. It was this contagious virus that was going around the lab, and then they would go home to their families and not pass it on. Never once did anyone pass it on. How odd. How is it that it was passing amongst people in this one laboratory, but it never passed to anyone else? So another thing they did in this internal investigation was they asked all of the staff, they interviewed pretty much everyone there at that company, and they asked if they had any suspicions, whether it was about people or about situations that could be making them ill, anything. And so many people said that they were suspicious of Graham Young. And he is just a suspicious guy in general. I mean, we'll get into the specifics in a minute as to why they all thought that, but think about it. He's very uninterested in talking to any of them unless it's about the war and Nazis and death and anything odd. This man he was not having normal conversations about how's the family, how's the kids, none of that. A few of them recalled odd, specific, eerie comments that Graham had made while he'd been working there. One of them being about how easy it would be to poison someone. And he even made a comment about oh, you wouldn't even know. There were a few more like that. Now that people were actually thinking about this, actually thinking about Graham having something to do with this, they were now you say it, he's said a couple of weird things about poisons. How specific? But they were only realising in retrospect. So now that the management were suspicious of Graham Young, they pulled up a bit of a timeline of the bovingdon bug, when it started, when it peaked, all these different things, when all the different cases happened. And they realised that it started literally as Graham joined the company. That was when everyone suddenly started getting ill, and on the days when Graham wouldn't be there at work, no one else would be ill. And another odd thing that Diane had noticed, his higher up, she mentioned to the management that were doing the investigation that it was odd that Graham himself had never contracted the bovingdon bug, not once. How was everyone around him continuously catching this same thing from each other, this contagious virus, yet he is never affected? So another thing they did as part of this investigation, the company had their in-house doctor. They had a doctor that worked on site. They had him do a bit of research into loads of different rare illnesses that the staff could be suffering from, Googling all their symptoms and then finding a list of possibilities. And then this doctor held a meeting where he reported back to the management and quite a few of the higher ups. And he was saying a load of things that it could possibly be and a list of things that he'd ruled out. And one of the things that he had ruled out was thallium poisoning. And Graham Young was actually in this meeting where he said that thallium poisoning was ruled out. And Graham heard this, and he was just dying to prove his knowledge of thallium. He always wanted to be right. He always wanted to prove that he was more knowledgeable and more intelligent than other people, and he just couldn't help himself. So he piped up in this meeting in front of everyone and said, well, actually, I think you'll find that the symptoms that all the staff are experiencing are very consistent with that of thallium poisoning. Why would you... He snitched on himself. Why would you do that? Like, I genuinely couldn't believe he did that. No, actually I can, because a lot of serial killers are like this. A lot of murderers, they're just very narcissistic and egotistical, and they don't care if it's actually going to get them into trouble. As long as they were right and they were more intelligent than everyone else, that's all that matters. So yeah, Graham said this in the meeting. He was like, actually, I think you'll find those symptoms are consistent. And so the doctor was just like, all right. And then he carried on his presentation, carried on going through all the things he'd ruled out, all the possibilities. And then after this meeting, the doctor was thinking, that were a bit odd. That were a bit odd from Graham. Why does he know so much about thallium poisoning? He's quite a young lad. That's a very specific niche interest to have. It just intrigued the doctor a bit. And so after the meeting, he went to go and talk to Graham. I think the way that the doctor kind of staged this was as if he was asking for Graham's knowledge on thallium poisoning. Clearly, Graham knew a lot about it, and the doctor could stand to learn something. So the doctor goes over to Graham, and he's asking him about thallium poisoning, and Graham can't resist from just word vomiting all this, detailed information about thallium poisoning and what doses are fatal and what symptoms come with certain doses. He's snitched on himself 100%. So this doctor immediately went and reported it to the management, who immediately went and reported it to the police. And one of the first things that police did was type in Graham Young's name on the database, and they found his previous criminal history. The previous criminal history that included cases of poisoning people. As soon as they saw that, they went straight down to Graham's auntie's house to go and arrest him. And as soon as they stormed in the door, they went over to him. He was like, what are you talking about? You've got the wrong guy. Auntie, no, trust me, it wasn't me. I didn't do anything. And then as soon as they got him out of the house and they were dragging him to the car, he turned to one of the officers and said, which one are you doing me for? So he did admit that he had done this to multiple people as well. He was asking which one they'd caught him for. Back at the police station, Graham Young was searched and he was found to have vials of Valium on his person at that very time. And there was so much more than that back at his house as well. They'd gotten a search warrant for his house and it had come in pretty quick. And as soon as they went in there, they found his absolute Nazi shrine of a bedroom, which was already the biggest red flag you could ever see going in someone's bedroom. They searched the whole room and they found vials upon vials upon vials of so many different chemicals, poisons, toxins, enough to kill over 200 people. They found a load of notebooks and diaries and stuff. I said he kept all those logs about what symptoms and what dosages he's given people. And he had written about every single co-worker that he had poisoned. He would call them by their initial. He would write what dose he gave them, what symptoms they had, and then if he was going to allow them to live or die. At some point in his diary, he even mentions how frustrating it is when he poisons his co-workers and then they end up having time off work. They have a few days off, sick, because then he can't watch them and monitor their symptoms and write them down in his book. That was the most annoying part of this process to him. And that's probably a factor in why he was calling the hospitals and the wives of his victims so much, because he was just trying to get an update on the symptoms so that he could write it in his book. He didn't actually care about their health or their well-being. It was just all part of his little experiment. There were other entries in this diary where Graham would laugh at the idea of the bovingdon bug, laugh at the fact that his victims had made up their own excuse as to why they were all ill, and they were all reinforcing that to each other. He never had to do anything. He never had to cover anything up. And everyone had liked him this whole time. Well, maybe not liked him, but everyone had gotten on with him this whole time. No one had ever really properly suspected him. And they'd never voiced it anyway, even if they had suspected him before now. His diaries revealed him to be responsible for hundreds of poisonings over the years, with over 70 of these being at his current workplace. And not only was there a victim list in his notebook of all the victims that he'd already poisoned, but there was also a future victims list, a hit list of people that he wanted to kill next. But back to the timeline. So that was everything they found in the search of his house, but back to the timeline, they have just arrested him and taken him down to the police station for questioning. And immediately, Graham Young confesses to everything, and I mean everything as well. He went into depth with his knowledge on thallium, telling police like how he'd learned all of this and what doses he would give to each victim when he wanted to see certain symptoms. He really knew how to get what he wanted to observe from his subject. You know what I mean? Because that's what this was to him. It was all just like one big science experiment on real living people. And then, curveball, Graham Young says something in his police confession that no one was expecting. He confessed to the murder of his stepmother, Molly, all those years ago. They were never even accusing him of that. They never even brought that up. It was him that brought it up off his own back, and he said, yep, I poisoned her too, killed her too. He even described it as the perfect murder because he had managed to get rid of the body without actually doing anything. All he'd done was convince his father to have his stepmother cremated, and his dad agreed. So then the body was burnt to ashes and there was no evidence that he had ever poisoned her. He said it was perfect. So police asked him why he had killed his stepmother all those years ago, and he said, I suppose I had ceased to see them as people, at least a part of me had. They were simply guinea pigs. So in the days following his arrest, Graham Young was already front page headline news. Everyone was talking about this poisoner serial killer, and the media had even nicknamed him at this point the Teacup Poisoner, which is what we know him as today. But Graham hates this. He hates that nickname. He was so mad when he found out that that was what he was being called, because he thought it seemed like too cutesy for an evil, big, scary, evil serial killer that poisons people and kills people. The Teacup Poisoner. So he tried to like make his own serial killer nickname for a while. He called himself the World Poisoner, but that never caught on, and he is still the Teacup Poisoner. In the end, Graham was charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 8 counts of different poisoning offences. At trial, he pled not guilty, so a full trial was done, and as part of the court trial, he was questioned by the prosecution, who said, right, well, if you're innocent, like you say, and if all of this is not true, then how do you explain your diary entries? You've literally written everything, detail by detail, what you did to all these individual people. How can you explain that? And Graham said, and I genuinely cannot believe he said this, he said that they were notes for a fantasy, sci-fi, horror novel that he was writing. They were his notes. That was his storyline. He was just really getting into it. Who is ever gonna believe that? And if all of that didn't prove that he was the killer enough, there was also quite a bit of physical evidence that we haven't actually talked about yet. So for one, they managed to get hold of a couple of his deceased victims' bodies. So Bob Eagle had actually already been cremated at this point in time, but they managed to collect his ashes. And they also still had Fred Biggs's body just in the morgue. And they tested both the body and the ashes and found traces of thallium in both of them. And that was actually the first time that ashes had ever been used as evidence in the UK, which I find really interesting. I don't know how often that has been done since, but this was the first instance of that. The jury ended up deliberating for less than 2 hours. I mean, it's very clear what had gone on here. And when they came back, they found Graham Young guilty on pretty much all of his charges. He was found guilty on the murder ones and the attempted murder ones, but I think he got off on most of the smaller poisoning charges. He was handed 4 life sentences for all of this, and Graham actually specifically requested that the judge send him to a normal prison this time and not back to Broadmoor, because he had such an awful time at Broadmoor. Every single patient around that time will have had an awful time at Broadmoor because it was allegedly very abusive there. No one would ever want to go back there. And the judge actually took pity on him and honoured his request. He wasn't going to send him to a prison though. He did think that Graham needed to be in a psychiatric hospital. So instead of Broadmoor, he sent him to Ashworth hospital. And in Ashworth, he was an absolute menace, right? He was such a pain in the ass for staff because, like I said earlier, this was like an addiction to him, or at least that's what he said. He said he felt as though he was addicted to the drugs himself. He just wasn't administering them to himself. He was administering them to others. But it was still that like crave and the hit of it every single time. So now that he's been put away in psychiatric hospital, he's still feeling these urges and craving making a poison. At least. And this man always found a way, right? So he managed to make a poison out of 7 different household products. He was like mixing them all in his cell, and before he actually got a chance to use it, the nurses found it and obviously confiscated it. And from that point on, they were really, really strict with Graham Young. He was constantly made to like move bedrooms so he wouldn't be able to like hide anything in any part of his room. He would be constantly just randomly checked on. Someone would just walk in his room and make sure he wasn't doing anything he shouldn't have been doing. After a few years at that hospital, I believe Graham was deemed like mentally well enough to go to a normal prison like he had actually requested in the first place. And so he was transferred to a prison on the Isle of Wight, which is quite an infamous prison. A lot of big UK criminals have been there, including Ian Brady, who was actually there in that prison at the same time as Graham Young. Ian Brady, if you don't know, is one of the Moors murderers, a sadistic, awful, evil serial killer from Manchester in England. He murdered and raped a bunch of different children. Genuinely one of the sickest men I've ever heard of. And Ian Brady was fascinated with Graham Young. The two of them became really good friends. They had a lot in common because Ian Brady was also very much fixated and interested on death and tragedy. He could talk about the war and the Nazis and serial killers and murder and death for hours. And like I say, Ian was fascinated by Graham because he was so young and so knowledgeable about everything that they would talk about, but especially about poisons. He had never met anyone that thought like that. I don't think any of us have. I've never met anyone so fixated on chemicals. Brady actually later went on to write a book. I think it was like a biography type thing, and of course he wrote about his time in this prison, and there was a little section in this book on Graham just because Ian was he was very much changed by meeting Graham Young, which is really interesting. He just seemed quite fascinated by him in general, not even so much his crimes and his stuff like that, just like his thought process and how he went about life. He even wrote in this book that he thought that Graham Young was just asexual, that he'd never had sex and never would have sex. He had no interest in a sexual relationship with anyone. He kind of got his gratification from poisoning. Brady said that Graham would become quite like uncomfortable or even just disinterested when sex would come up in conversation, because Ian would bring it up quite a bit because that was a part of his crimes, whereas that had never been anything even in Graham's life at all. As far as I'm aware, he never had a girlfriend or a boyfriend or anything like that because he was just away in hospital, and then he came out and immediately started poisoning people at his workplace. He never had chance for any kind of romantic life at all. But yeah, Brady said that Graham would get quite uncomfortable about it, and instead he was excited only by power, clinic experimentation, and death. That was how he got his gratification in life, was poisoning and killing people. Graham Young passed away in prison on August 1st, 2000 at the age of 42. His death was recorded as heart failure, which some people find a little suspicious, maybe for a couple of reasons, because he was only 42 years old, which is quite young to just be having heart failure out of nowhere as well. He had no previous heart problems or heart attacks or anything of the sort. It really came out of nowhere when he was very, very young. And there's a few theories about this. Some people think that the hospital are trying to cover something up. Not really sure what, and that's about as far as I'm willing to go with that theory. Oh, it's not the hospital, it was the prison that he died in, wasn't it? They think that the prison's trying to cover something up. But the theory that I'm kind of leaning towards a little bit more is that maybe he had found a way to commit suicide and poison himself. We've seen him manage to get hold of poisons some way or another, no matter where he is. He can extract toxic chemicals from things and create a poison from pretty much anything. He's done it with some random bushes in the yard at Broadmoor. He's done it with cleaning products in the other hospital. Chances are he could have found a way to poison himself and take his own life. Maybe he was bored of life in prison. And that would explain why there were like no other symptoms or like he wasn't ill in the run up to his death or anything like that. So that is where Graham's story ends, but that's not where this whole case ends, because there's a couple of things I actually want to talk about first. There's also been another tragedy that is believed by some people to be a direct result of another Graham Young poisoning. In 1973, a man named Howard Grodnow had read the news. As soon as the Teacup Poisoner had been found, it was front page news. He saw this story in the newspaper and suddenly became very paranoid that he could be a surviving victim of Graham's. He'd had terrible chest pains and a couple of other symptoms for years, for pretty much as long as he can remember, from like his early 20s. And in fact, he can trace back to the exact day that he started getting these pains. It was one particular night when he'd been out at a pub in Hemel Hempstead, drinking with some random guy that seemed to have a huge interest in poisons and chemicals. It's all very much adding up, isn't it? The math is definitely mathing. So he became convinced that that night in that pub he had met Graham Young, and he must have poisoned him and given him these lifelong chest pains and different issues. And Howard became so fixated on this idea that I think it made him very depressed, and he ended up taking his own life. So that's why a lot of people attribute this death potentially to Graham Young, although there's no way for us to be able to prove that Graham had poisoned Howard. But I thought that was quite interesting to add in here. And there's also another quite interesting little side story that I want to add about a copycat killer. In 2005, a 16-year-old Japanese schoolgirl was arrested for the attempted murder of her mother when she tried to poison her with thallium. It was discovered that this young girl kept an online blog about like different poisoners and killers and people like that, and she was very much a fan of Graham Young. She would post about him often, and she actually carried out this crime almost to a T like Graham's. So she had the notebooks and everything, and she would log what dose she gave her mother, what symptoms her mother was experiencing. Like I say, this girl was done for attempted murder, which makes me think that her mum survived, of course, but I did hear that she was in a coma for a very, very long time. I don't know if she's still in that coma. I don't know if she's managed to recover since then. But that is all I have on this case. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I feel like this one's been a bit of a long one again, so thanks for sticking around for another one. And thanks again to Casetify for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you go to casetify.com/Eleanor, you'll get 15% off of your order automatically applied at checkout. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting the channel and helping me decide the cases that I cover. All of my tier 2 members are on screen right now, so thank you so much. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the join button down below. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up. That would really help me out. If you want to subscribe, you can click this circle with my face on, or if you want to watch another video of mine, there. I gave myself the ick. Bye.